They said I was marrying into a dream, a life of elegance, security, and untouchable luxury. But as the wedding bells rang, all I felt was the slow tightening of invisible chains around my heart. I should have been radiant, the kind of bride every girl dreams of becoming. But behind my smile lived a storm I couldn't silence. Each beat of the organ echoed the choices I made out of fear, not love, and every step toward that altar pulled me further away from myself. I didn't realize it that morning, but that day wasn't the start of a fairy tale. It was the quiet beginning of my downfall. The perfume of roses filled the air, so thick it almost suffocated me. Cameras flashed, voices murmured, and the entire church shimmered in gold and crystal. But the weight of the gown felt heavier than sin itself. I remember thinking how strange it was, how something so beautiful could feel like a punishment. Thomas, my soon-to-be husband, stood at the altar with that polished smile that could charm anyone, a man born into power, the kind who didn't fall in love. He acquired. Everyone called me lucky. They said I had won the kind of life people spend generations chasing. But they didn't see the truth beneath the lace and diamonds. They didn't see the fear. I wasn't marrying a man. I was marrying security, a promise of safety for my family, an escape from the hunger that had followed us for years. I told myself love would grow later, that affection could be learned the way manners are, with enough patience and practice. But deep down, I already knew. I was selling my freedom for comfort. As I walked down the aisle, the orchestra swelled, and hundreds of eyes followed me, admiring, envying, judging. The sound of my heels against the marble floor echoed like the ticking of a clock counting down to something terrible. I saw Thomas waiting at the end, handsome, composed, confident, the perfect picture of stability. And yet, his eyes, sharp and cold, held no warmth, no excitement, only possession. I looked beyond him for a single second, and that's when I saw him. The driver. Standing near the grand doors, straight-backed. Still, his eyes fixed on me. Daniel. I had seen him a few times before, always quiet, always professional. But that day, something in his expression made my heart falter. It wasn't admiration or desire. It was recognition, like he could see through the silk and gold straight into the part of me that wanted to run. I looked away quickly, afraid someone might notice. But as the ceremony went on, I couldn't stop thinking about that brief connection, that silent understanding from a man who was supposed to remain invisible. I heard the priest speak of devotion, trust, and eternal love, words that slid past me like smoke. When he asked if I would take Thomas to be my husband, my lips moved on their own. I do. The applause that followed sounded hollow, like thunder over an empty field. Thomas's hand gripped mine tightly, a little too tightly, as if reminding me that I now belonged to him. The photographer called for us to kiss, and when our lips met, I felt nothing. No spark, no warmth, only the chill of commitment made without love. The guests erupted into cheers, flashes exploded, and all I could do was stare past the glittering crowd, my heart pounding against my ribs as if trying to escape. During the reception, the hall overflowed with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Thomas was in his element, shaking hands with investors, entertaining politicians, introducing me as his greatest achievement. I played the part flawlessly, smiling, nodding, laughing when expected, while the champagne burned down my throat like guilt. But between the swirl of gowns and tuxedos, my eyes searched for that one face. And there he was. Daniel. Standing discreetly by the entrance, waiting for instructions, his expression calm but unreadable. For a brief moment, our eyes met again, and something unspoken passed between us, something dangerous and electric. I should have looked away, but I didn't, because in that crowded, suffocating room, he was the only person who saw me, not as Mrs. Wainwright, not as a social trophy, but as a woman silently breaking beneath her own choices. Later that night, when the last guest had left and the mansion lights dimmed, I stood before the mirror in the bridal suite, still wearing my dress. The jewels on my neck glittered like chains. Thomas entered the room, smiling that same hollow smile, and whispered, "You did well today." His words felt like a command rather than praise. I nodded, pretending not to hear the subtle threat beneath his calm tone. When he turned away, I caught my reflection. Flawless, composed, empty. I don't know how long I stared before I noticed the window slightly open. A cool breeze slipped in, carrying the faint hum of an engine outside. I walked closer, parted the curtain, and there, in the dim light of the driveway, stood Daniel beside the car, waiting. His head tilted slightly upward, as though he sensed me watching. Our eyes met for the third time that day. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. He just stood there, steady, grounded, like a promise I didn't yet understand. The next moment, Thomas called my name, and I turned back, closing the curtain as if sealing a secret between us. I didn't sleep that night. The sound of the car starting echoed faintly in the distance, disappearing into the silence of the estate, but it lingered in my mind long after. I lay beside a man everyone envied me for having, and realized I had never felt more alone. The walls shimmered with gold, but inside, everything was gray. My life of luxury had begun, and already I wanted to escape it. That night I told myself I would learn to live with this emptiness, that I would adapt. But deep inside, a whisper warned me that fate wasn't done with me yet, because the man who drove me into this new life, the quiet stranger I couldn't stop thinking about, was destined to drive me right out of it. And someday soon, he wouldn't just hold my gaze, he would hold my future in his hands. They say wealth brings comfort, but I learned quickly that comfort without love is just another kind of prison, one lined with silk instead of steel. From the moment I stepped through the grand doors of Thomas's mansion, I knew I had traded my freedom for a beautiful cage, a place so perfect it dared you to pretend you were happy while quietly draining the life out of you. The chandeliers sparkled like frozen stars, the marble floors gleamed with impossible polish, and yet every inch of that mansion carried a silence that hummed like grief, the kind that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. I thought I had escaped struggle, but I had only escaped warmth, and now I was trapped inside a palace that echoed with my own emptiness. Thomas's world was a masterpiece of order and control, a place where nothing was out of place, not even me. Every morning began with the same ritual. Breakfast served on gold-rimmed plates, conversations about numbers and investments, and his voice, smooth and distant, reminding me of expectations I hadn't agreed to, but somehow owed him. When we went out together, he was charming, attentive, the kind of man who could make strangers believe he worshipped the ground I walked on. But the moment the doors closed behind us, that illusion evaporated into thin air. His words became weapons disguised as concern, subtle enough to make me question my own sanity. He didn't shout or strike. He simply erased me, piece by piece, with his indifference. I began to move through the house like a ghost, tracing the edges of furniture I never chose, surrounded by people who pretended not to see me. The staff were trained to perfection, polite, obedient, and utterly terrified. They bowed when I entered, avoided my eyes, and disappeared at the sound of Thomas's footsteps. Even their whispers seemed rehearsed, as though fear had become part of the decor. I used to think loneliness was the absence of people, but now I understood. It was being surrounded by people who refused to see you. I tried to fill the emptiness with distraction. I played piano again after years, letting music pour out of me like a confession, but no one listened. I ordered flowers for every room, hoping the scent might trick me into feeling alive, but Thomas called it wasteful sentiment. I even painted once, late at night, when the world was asleep. And the next morning, my canvas was gone, quietly removed, as if my expression itself was an inconvenience. Every day blurred into the next until time lost its meaning. The mansion became a calendar of echoes, the footsteps of maids, the distant clink of cutlery, the hollow tick of a clock that never seemed to move fast enough. I would stare out the window for hours, watching the city below pulse with life, wondering how far I'd have to walk before someone looked at me without expectation or pity. And then there was Daniel. Thomas had assigned him as my driver shortly after the wedding, a man meant to handle logistics, not emotions. But somehow, his quiet presence became the only thing in that house that felt real. He never looked directly at me unless necessary, but when he did, his gaze was steady, calm, and strangely gentle, like he was speaking a language that didn't need words. On our morning drives, the world outside would blur, yet in the stillness of that car, I felt more seen than I had in months of marriage. He was courteous, but never rehearsed, kind without trying, and his silence carried an understanding I didn't know I was desperate for. Once, when I thanked him for holding the door, he looked at me with genuine surprise, as if gratitude was something he rarely received. Another time, when I apologized for keeping him waiting, he said softly, "Waiting isn't so bad when it's peaceful." And for a fleeting second, I envied his calm, that quiet acceptance of life's unfairness I had long forgotten how to hold. I began to notice him everywhere, his reflection in the car mirror, his steady hands on the steering wheel, his careful movements whenever Thomas was near. He was cautious, always alert, as though he carried a secret he couldn't afford to reveal. And yet, beneath that restraint, there was something unspoken between us, something that terrified me precisely because it felt alive. One evening, just as the sun melted into the horizon and the sky turned the color of dying fire, I stepped into the car, expecting the same polite silence that had become our unspoken routine. But Daniel turned toward me, his voice low and deliberate, the first trace of defiance I had ever heard from him. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes flickering toward the mansion, "you should be careful who you trust in this house." For a moment I couldn't breathe, because in his tone wasn't warning. It was fear. And in that instant, I knew something inside those gilded walls was far more dangerous than loneliness itself. He was supposed to stay invisible, a man whose presence began and ended with the sound of an engine. But Daniel noticed every crack in the perfect world I pretended to live in. His eyes never wandered, yet they seemed to see everything, not just the reflection of a woman sitting quietly in the back seat, but the fracture lines beneath her calm. He never crossed a line, never asked a question, but somehow his silence understood me in ways words never could. And though I tried to convince myself that he was just my driver, deep down, I knew that in a house full of secrets, he was the only soul who could truly see me. After that evening, the one where he warned me not to trust everyone in my own home, something shifted between us, something I couldn't name, but could feel in the air whenever he was near. I replayed his words over and over, wondering who he meant, what he knew, and why his voice had carried the weight of real fear. Every time I saw him afterward, I caught the faintest shadow of caution in his eyes, as if he regretted saying too much. Yet even in his restraint, I found safety. Thomas's schedule grew heavier as the months passed, and with it, my freedom became paradoxically wider, yet more watched. I was encouraged to attend charity galas, social dinners, art auctions, not because he cared about my happiness, but because my presence made him look generous, attentive, and human. Daniel drove me everywhere, his posture straight, his movements precise, his tone professional. But in those silent car rides, a strange comfort began to grow between us, fragile but undeniable. I remember one night vividly. It was raining, the city blurred behind the windows, and I felt a sadness I couldn't contain anymore. I didn't realize I was crying until I saw my reflection trembling in the glass. Daniel glanced into the mirror, his eyes meeting mine, just long enough to understand. Without saying a word, he reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a clean napkin, and passed it back to me with a simple gesture that broke something open inside me. I don't know why that moment mattered so much. Maybe because it was the first act of kindness I'd felt in months, or because he offered it without judgment, without pity, without asking what was wrong. His silence didn't demand explanation. It gave me permission to feel human again. I held that napkin in my hand like a lifeline, realizing that a simple gesture from the wrong man could feel more intimate than 1,000 forced kisses from the right one. After that night, something unspoken took root. I began talking more, little things at first, comments about the weather, the traffic, the events we attended. He listened, always listening, his responses short but sincere. Then one afternoon, as we drove along the coast, he surprised me. "You read a lot," he said quietly, eyes still on the road. I turned to him, startled. "How would you know that?" "You carry the same book for days," he said with a faint smile. "People who fake reading change pages too often." It was such a small, almost teasing observation, but it made me laugh. A real laugh, the kind that caught me off guard. I told him about my love for poetry, how it used to be my escape when I was younger. He told me he once dreamed of being a painter before life taught him that dreams don't pay bills. That small exchange stretched into hours of conversation on long drives, two strangers confessing the parts of themselves that no one else cared to see. I told him how I felt invisible in my own home, how even the walls seemed to conspire to keep me quiet. He didn't offer solutions, only said, "Sometimes silence is the only language that keeps you safe." And, though the words sounded simple, I understood their weight. He wasn't just speaking about me. In his quiet way, Daniel became a mirror to everything I'd lost. Warmth, honesty, simplicity. With him, I didn't need to pretend, didn't need to polish my words or hide my sadness. The car became the only place I could breathe freely, a sanctuary moving through the world, yet untouched by it. But I was naive to think that peace could last. Secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, have a scent. And Thomas had started to notice. He began asking where I went, who I spoke to, why I smiled so much lately. His tone was casual, but his eyes were knives. I thought I could hide the truth in glances and unspoken words, that no one could see the small universe Daniel and I had built between moments of silence. But freedom, I would soon learn, always demands payment. And the cost of being seen, even for a moment, was far greater than I could afford. Because in a house ruled by power, affection itself was treason. And I was already guilty. Freedom has a price, and I was about to learn how expensive it could be. It started with thunder outside and chaos inside my heart. There are moments in life when nature seems to mirror your emotions so perfectly that you wonder if the sky itself has chosen sides. And that night, as lightning slashed across the darkness, it felt as though the heavens were tearing open the lie I had built my life upon. Thomas had left for a week-long business trip, and for the first time in months, the mansion felt less like a prison and more like a breathing thing, alive with silence that didn't threaten me. I didn't know it yet, but that storm was not just weather. It was a warning, an omen of the kind of truth that once seen can never be unseen. The first crack of thunder arrived like a drumbeat against my chest, followed by the flicker of chandeliers struggling to stay lit. The rain came soon after, relentless, punishing, as though the sky itself was cleansing something no human hand could touch. I had been reading in the library, trying to lose myself in words, when the lights finally surrendered. The entire mansion plunged into darkness, swallowing the world in silence. For a few moments I just sat there, my heart thudding in the stillness, until I saw the faint glow of a flashlight cutting through the hallway. "Ma'am?" a voice called softly. Steady, familiar. It was Daniel. He appeared in the doorway, his figure outlined by the storm's silver light, and for a fleeting second, I forgot to breathe. "The power's out across the whole estate," he said, holding the flashlight up slightly. "I came to make sure you were all right." The sincerity in his voice carried warmth I hadn't heard in weeks. I wanted to tell him I was fine, that he didn't need to worry, but the truth clung to my throat, like fog. "I'm fine," I whispered anyway, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. He stepped closer, his boots silent on the carpet, his presence filling the emptiness the storm had left behind. "It's safer to stay in one room until the generator kicks in," he said gently. "Do you want me to light some candles?" I nodded, watching as he moved with practiced grace, striking matches and placing candles along the table. The soft light painted everything in gold and shadow. His face half lit, half lost to the dark, his eyes reflecting a quiet steadiness that made the storm outside seem almost distant. We sat across from each other, the candle flames flickering between us. For the first time since I'd known him, I let the silence stretch, not as something to escape, but as something that connected us. He asked if I wanted him to wait nearby, in case I got nervous. I don't know what possessed me, but I said, "Stay." And he did. At first we spoke about simple things, the storm, the power lines, the inconvenience of it all. But the conversation began to drift, carried by the intimacy of the dark. He told me about his childhood, about a small town where he'd learned to fix cars because he couldn't afford to have anyone else do it. I told him about the poetry I used to write, the dreams I'd buried under silk and gold. He listened like no one ever had, his attention soft but absolute, as though every word I spoke deserved a place in the world. Then, something unexpected happened. I laughed. It wasn't polite or rehearsed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere forgotten. Daniel looked almost startled, and then he smiled. Not the professional half-smile I was used to, but something real, something that lit the room more than the candles ever could. I don't remember what we said after that, only the feeling, the rare comfort of being completely seen. The storm outside raged louder, lightning flashing through the windows, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped to watch us. I noticed a strand of hair had fallen over my face, and before I could reach for it, Daniel leaned forward. His hand hesitated in the air, suspended between courage and restraint. And then, slowly, gently, he brushed the strand aside, his fingers grazing my skin. The touch was fleeting, nothing more than a whisper, but it set off something inside me that no words could ever explain. My breath caught. My heart betrayed me. We didn't speak after that. We didn't move. The space between us became charged, fragile, alive. The candles crackled softly, and for a long, suspended heartbeat, the world was reduced to two people sitting in a room full of secrets they could no longer deny. I could hear the echo of my own pulse, the storm pounding against the windows, and his quiet breathing across the table. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The air between us was already electric, pulsing with everything unspoken. Then suddenly, the lights flickered back to life, breaking the spell as abruptly as it had formed. Daniel stood quickly, his composure returning like a mask sliding back into place, while I sat frozen, the glow of the chandeliers revealing everything the darkness had hidden. The candles still burned, their flames trembling, as though aware of the line we had almost crossed. And in that blinding moment of clarity, I realized the truth that terrified me more than the storm itself. I was no longer loyal to my husband. When the lights came back on, I realized I was standing in the ruins of my own loyalty. Secrets are like smoke. The harder you try to hide them, the faster they spread, curling through cracks you didn't even know existed. After that stormy night, nothing looked different on the surface, yet everything inside me had shifted, trembling beneath the weight of what hadn't even happened. The house still stood tall and golden, the staff still bowed, the air still smelled of roses and money. But the silence had changed. It had become watchful. Every step I took echoed too loudly, every glance felt like an accusation, and somewhere deep down, I knew the walls were listening. When Thomas returned from his business trip, I greeted him with the same practiced smile I'd worn since the wedding, but this time, my face betrayed me. He kissed my cheek, asked about the house, the staff, the accounts, everything except me. And yet I could feel his eyes studying me with quiet calculation. I tried to act normal, but guilt is a terrible actor. It seeps into your tone, your timing, even your breathing. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope between two worlds, the one I lived in and the one I longed for. Daniel, ever cautious, returned to being the silent professional, keeping his distance more than before. He avoided my eyes, spoke only when necessary, and his politeness became a wall I couldn't climb. But that distance, that deliberate restraint, only made the truth between us louder. Love, once awakened, doesn't go back to sleep. It simply hides in plain sight, burning quieter, but deeper. The servants noticed before anyone else did. It was never blatant, just the subtle shift in their glances, the sudden end of whispers when I entered a room, the uneasy tension that lingered like perfume in the halls. Once I caught the headmaid watching me with something like pity, and for a terrifying moment, I wondered if she could see the storm I was carrying inside me. Then came Thomas's sister, Eleanor. Sharp, elegant, and cruel in the way only people who've never been denied anything can be. She visited often, claiming to check on me, but her eyes flicked from my face to Daniel's every time we were in the same room. She was a woman who enjoyed puzzles, and I was becoming her favorite one. I tried to behave as though nothing had changed. I smiled more, laughed louder, attended every event Thomas requested. But the harder I tried to look untouched, the more people seemed to sense the truth beneath the surface. I could feel the mansion turning against me. Every servant's glance, every echoing corridor, every whisper behind closed doors became a reminder that secrets have lives of their own. Daniel, ever careful, began avoiding routes that would trap us alone together. He dropped me at entrances instead of walking me inside, kept the radio on during drives, and never spoke unless absolutely necessary. It was unbearable, but I understood. He was trying to protect me, from suspicion, from gossip, from the consequences that could ruin us both. Still, I couldn't let go. So I began leaving small notes, harmless, almost invisible tokens that said nothing, yet meant everything. A thank you tucked beneath the seat cushion, a folded page left in the glove compartment, words that only we would understand. You make the silence bearable. I see you. Sometimes he'd leave a reply, a single phrase scribbled on the back. You shouldn't. But even that warning, written in his precise, careful handwriting, felt like affection. Those notes became our lifeline, proof that what had happened in the storm-lit room wasn't madness, that I hadn't imagined the tenderness in his eyes. Each secret exchange made the danger heavier, but it also made the world feel real again. I began to anticipate those stolen moments more than sleep, more than peace. The tension between us was no longer something to hide from. It was something I needed just to feel alive. But fate, as always, was listening. One evening, as I was preparing for yet another dinner party, I noticed something off in Thomas's manner. He seemed unusually calm, almost gentle. He complimented my dress, poured me a drink, even asked about my day. Small, meaningless gestures that felt like a setup. I tried to push away the unease, but my instincts were screaming. Later that night, as I walked past his study, I heard the faint rustle of paper. And then his voice, low, dangerous, deliberate. Interesting handwriting, he murmured. I froze. Peering through the slightly open door, I saw him sitting at his desk, holding something small between his fingers. A folded note, cream-colored, the same kind I had been using. My heart stopped as he unfolded it slowly, reading the words I had written hours earlier. "You make the silence bearable." I wanted to burst into the room, to say it was a misunderstanding, a harmless note for a friend, anything to erase the truth that hung in the air. But my body wouldn't move. I stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching my own destruction unfold. Thomas didn't shout. He didn't rage. He just smiled, a small quiet smile that chilled my blood, and placed the note neatly on the desk beside his glass of whiskey. The way he stared at it, you'd think it was a riddle he intended to solve, piece by piece. I stumbled back, heart pounding so hard it drowned out the ticking clock. The walls seemed to close in, the air itself turning heavy with dread. I knew what Thomas was capable of when crossed. I had seen it in the way he broke people without raising his voice. And now, I wasn't sure if he had truly understood what the note meant, or if he was simply pretending, waiting for me to hang myself with my own secret. Until one night, Thomas found a note that wasn't meant for him, and I realized the storm outside had nothing on the one I had just unleashed inside my home. His voice thundered louder than any storm I'd ever heard, shaking the air, cracking through the fragile calm that had held this house together for too long. I had always known Thomas was dangerous in his silence, a man who preferred control over chaos. But that night, the silence broke, and what came out was fury disguised as precision. He wasn't shouting just to be heard. He was shouting because he already knew, because my guilt was written across my face like a confession I could no longer bury. And as he stood there in the dim light of the study, the note trembling in his hand, I realized that all my lies had finally run out of places to hide. It began with a single word, my name, spoken too softly, too calmly. Clara. The way he said it made my skin crawl. I had been standing in the hallway, trying to steady my breathing after overhearing him in the study. But when he called for me, my legs moved on instinct. The study door stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. He was at his desk, back straight, the note laid open beside a half-empty glass of whiskey. The smell of smoke and liquor hung thick in the air, a warning of the explosion about. "Close the door," he said, and the low timbre of his voice carried more threat than when the latch clicked shut behind. He picked up the note. He sensed trouble, but instead, he stepped into the room, his presence filling the space between me and Thomas like a shield made of quiet defiance. Thomas turned toward him, fury flashing in his eyes. "Perfect," he sneered. "The loyal servant appears right on cue." Daniel didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on Thomas, unwavering. "This isn't her fault," he said, his tone even, but his voice carried a weight that silenced everything else in the room. Thomas's laughter was sharp and cruel. "Not her fault?" He gestured toward me, shaking the note. "She writes love letters to my driver, and you think she's innocent?" My breath caught. Love letters. The word sounded like poison on his tongue. Daniel took a step forward, his shoulders squared. "She didn't write that for me," he lied smoothly. "It was mine. I dropped it by mistake." Thomas's expression twisted, disbelief, then mock amusement. "So now you write poetry too?" Daniel didn't blink. "I meant it for no one. I was careless. She had nothing to do with it." His voice didn't waver, but I could hear the tremor underneath. The cost of taking the blame that wasn't his. My throat burned. I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that I had written it, that this was my doing. But one look at Daniel's face stopped me. His eyes said everything. "Don't." Thomas stared at him for a long, terrible moment, then exhaled slowly, his rage cooling into something far more dangerous. Control. "Get out," he said finally, his tone deadly calm. Daniel didn't move. "Sir, I said get out," Thomas roared, slamming his hand against the desk. "You're finished here. I don't want to see your face again. You'll never work in this city, not under my name. not under anyone who values their reputation. The words hung heavy in the air, final and cruel. Daniel nodded once, a quiet acceptance that broke my heart more than any argument ever could. He turned to me then, and for a single breath, the world disappeared. The mansion, the storm, the rage. It was just us. His eyes held everything he couldn't say. Apology, sorrow, love. He didn't plead. He didn't explain. He simply looked at me, one last time, the corners of his lips lifting in the faintest broken smile, before turning toward the door. Thomas stood there, watching with a predator's satisfaction, while I stood frozen, caught between guilt and grief. The sound of the door closing behind Daniel was louder than thunder, and in its echo, I felt something inside me collapse. The house was suddenly too quiet, the air too heavy, the silence too alive. I wanted to run after him, to scream that it wasn't fair, that I never meant for this to happen. But my feet wouldn't move. Thomas poured himself another drink, his calm returning like a tide, retreating after destruction. And I realized he thought he had won. But as the echo of Daniel's footsteps faded into the night, I knew something irreversible had happened. Because in that silent goodbye, I realized he wasn't just walking away from a job. He was walking away from me. Freedom never felt so far away, and yet it lived only a few locked doors beyond my reach, whispering through the hallways like a ghost I could almost touch, but never hold. After Daniel's dismissal, the mansion grew quieter, colder, as though even the walls had been commanded to forget his name, and still every breath I took carried his memory. I had once thought loneliness was emptiness, but now I understood it was captivity. Being alive inside a life that no longer belonged to you. Each sunrise promised light, yet none of it ever reached me. The house itself had become a golden cage built from my own choices. Thomas's anger that night had not burned out. It had only changed shape. The next morning, he appeared at breakfast, perfectly calm, impeccably dressed, his tone polished to civility, and that frightened me more than the shouting ever had. He spoke about new security measures, about loyalty, about how people take advantage of kindness, never mentioning Daniel by name, but making sure I understood that mercy was a privilege I would not be granted again. Every rule that followed felt less like protection and more like punishment wrapped in concern. He replaced the staff within a week, the old maids, the quiet gardener, even the cook who had known me since the wedding. In their place came strangers with practiced smiles and expressionless eyes. They addressed me as Mrs. Wainwright in tones stripped of warmth, and I realized they weren't there to serve. They were there to watch. Every corridor seemed to hum with surveillance, every mirror reflecting not just my image, but my obedience. The phone in my room was removed for repairs. The car keys disappeared, and the garden gate that once opened onto the road was locked with a chain I could hear clinking whenever the wind moved. Even the piano, my one refuge, was silenced when Thomas claimed the music distracted him. Slowly, methodically, he trimmed away every fragment of independence until I existed only within the perimeter of his will. Days lost their edges. Morning blended into evening in a haze of artificial routine. Tea served at precise hours, meals eaten under supervision, conversations reduced to yes or no. I learned to keep my voice gentle, my expressions measured, because even the smallest flicker of defiance invited questions I couldn't afford to answer. At night, I would lie awake, listening to the tick of the hallway clock. The only sound that reminded me, time was still moving somewhere beyond these walls. Yet in that suffocating stillness, my mind refused to die. I began to dream again, dangerous, beautiful dreams of escape. I imagined running down the long driveway barefoot, the gravel biting my skin, the gates bursting open onto a road that smelled of rain and freedom. I imagined Daniel's voice calling my name from somewhere beyond the trees, steady and patient, promising safety. But when the dreams faded with dawn, I woke to find the doors still locked, and courage still missing. Thomas often left me small reminders of his power. A jewelry box placed deliberately on my vanity, a diamond necklace resting where I couldn't ignore it, each gem glittering like a threat. "You deserve the best," he would say, fastening the clasp at my throat. His touch was always careful, but the weight of the stones felt heavier than chains. He wanted me to remember that even my beauty belonged to him. Sometimes I caught the new butler watching me as I passed, his gaze calculating, waiting for mistakes he could report. The house had become a theater of fear where I performed the role of the devoted wife to an audience of spies. But inside, I was unraveling. Every time I thought of Daniel, of the way he had stood up for me, of the quiet strength in his eyes, something in my chest ached like an open wound that refused to heal. I began writing letters I never sent. Words poured out of me at night, confessions to a man who would never read them. I hid them between pages of books, inside empty vases, beneath floorboards. They were my rebellion, my proof that I still existed beyond the silence Thomas demanded. And though no one read them, each sentence felt like a breath stolen from the life he'd tried to suffocate. The days stretched on, gold and lifeless, until I could no longer tell if the prison was built by Thomas or by my own fear of what might happen if I tried to leave. I was rich in money, yes, draped in luxury, surrounded by excess. But I was bankrupt in every way that mattered. Courage, freedom, hope. Then, one sleepless night, as I sat at my dressing table staring at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized, I heard the faint scrape of paper beneath the door. My pulse quickened as I bent to pick it up. A folded envelope, unmarked, the handwriting sharp, yet familiar. I tore it open with trembling hands, and as my eyes raced across the first line, the air seemed to vanish from the room. It wasn't from Thomas. It wasn't from anyone in this house. It was from him. Daniel's words, written in ink dark as the night itself, waited to rewrite the world I thought was finished. Until the night I found the letter that would change everything. His handwriting shook my soul before I even opened the envelope. There was something about the way the ink curved across the paper, steady, familiar, achingly careful, that made my hands tremble before my eyes had even met the words. It had been weeks since Daniel had vanished from my world, yet in that instant, it felt as though the air itself carried his scent, his silence, his sorrow. The moment I touched that letter, every locked door, every shadowed hallway, every ounce of fear inside me seemed to lean in and listen. I remember standing there in the dim glow of my vanity light, the storm of the previous night still whispering through the cracks of the window, the world holding its breath as I slid my finger beneath the seal. There was no name written on the front, but I didn't need one. The moment I saw the first line, my heart recognized him before my mind did. "I don't expect forgiveness," it began, "but I can't let you disappear." The words hit harder than any scream ever could. His handwriting was neat, but pressed deeply into the page, as if each sentence was carved from something heavier than ink. He wrote of the days after he'd been dismissed, of how he had left the city quietly, taking only what he could carry, disappearing into a small riverside town where no one knew his name. He said the silence there reminded him of me, and yet it was kinder than the one that haunted the mansion. "I have work now," he wrote. "It's honest. Small jobs, driving, repairs. I earn little, but at least I sleep without fear. Still, I can't stop wondering if you're safe. I shouldn't write this, but if you ever find the strength to leave, I'll be where the road meets the river." I read that line again and again until the words blurred into nothing. My tears soaked the ink, turning the message into a storm of its own. The room seemed to tilt as I sank into the chair, clutching the letter to my chest, like a heartbeat I didn't want to lose. For the first time since Daniel's departure, I felt something stronger than fear, hope, fragile and dangerous, but alive. I hid the letter beneath my pillow, though I knew it wasn't truly safe there. Thomas's new staff inspected every room under the guise of maintenance, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy the only piece of freedom I'd touched in months. Every night, after the house fell silent, I would take it out and read it again, tracing the words until I could almost hear his voice whispering them in the dark. That letter became my secret companion, my rebellion, my reason to keep breathing. I began to imagine it, the road, the river, the feeling of wind on my face with no eyes watching, no voice controlling, no locks to keep me inside. I could see myself there, standing barefoot by the water, and him beside me, not as a driver or a servant, but as a man, as the only person who had ever truly seen me. The fantasy grew stronger with each passing day. I started to plan in secret, mapping out how I might escape, the shift changes of the guards, the nights when Thomas stayed late in his office, the keys that hung in the servants' quarters. Every detail mattered because I knew there would be no second chance. But the danger grew with the hope. Thomas's behavior had changed, subtle but sharp. He began keeping his study door locked, his tone sweeter, his smile quieter. I could feel his suspicion returning like the tide. Once during dinner, he looked up from his plate and said, "You've been very quiet lately," his eyes holding mine a moment too long. It wasn't a question. It was a test. I excused myself, claiming fatigue, and spent the rest of the night clutching the letter under my pillow, listening to my own pulse in the dark. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. I knew I couldn't delay forever. One wrong glance, one misplaced step, and everything would unravel. I rehearsed my escape in whispers, mouthing the words as if they were prayers. Wait for the moon. Take nothing heavy. Walk to the gate when the lights go out. Each time I recited it, I felt braver, more certain. Then came the morning when the world cracked open. It was early, dawn just brushing the sky, when I noticed something wrong. My pillow felt lighter, the fabric cold where warmth should have been. My heart stumbled as I lifted it. The letter was gone. For a moment I convinced myself I had misplaced it. I tore through drawers, flipped open books, checked every hiding place. Nothing. The panic that gripped me was worse than fear. It was knowledge. Someone had been in my room while I slept. When I went downstairs for breakfast, Thomas was already there. He was reading the newspaper, the picture of calm, his coffee steaming beside him. But when he looked up, his smile was too controlled, too deliberate. "You were restless last night," he said softly. "Bad dreams." The words sliced through me like a blade. My pulse roared in my ears as he folded the newspaper neatly and set it aside. His hand rested on the table, fingers tapping lightly, rhythmically, as if keeping time with my terror. I forced a smile, pretending not to understand, but deep down, I already knew. He had the letter. He'd read it, and the look in his eyes told me the game was over. Only I didn't yet know how he planned to end it, because someone else had found the letter before I could act. And now, escape wasn't just dangerous, it was impossible. I trusted the wrong person, and paid for it, dearly. In a house filled with secrets, it wasn't the strangers I should have feared, but the ones who smiled at me every morning, the ones who called me dear while measuring the price of my mistakes. Betrayal doesn't always arrive in fury or noise. Sometimes it walks on quiet feet, wearing silk and perfume, pretending to care while sharpening the knife behind your back. And when I finally saw the truth, it was already too late. The letter that could have saved me had become the weapon that would destroy me. Thomas didn't confront me that morning, not directly. He didn't need to. The silence in his movements told me everything. He didn't look at me the way a husband looks at a wife. He looked at me the way a collector looks at something valuable that is cracked. The letter was gone from my room, but its shadow followed me through every hallway. I could feel his eyes even when he wasn't there, feel the weight of suspicion pressing down on my every breath. By evening, The truth surfaced like oil in water. It wasn't Thomas who had found the letter first. It was his sister, Eleanor. She had always hovered at the edges of our marriage like a vulture waiting for the slightest scent of decay. Beautiful, sharp, and cruel, Eleanor had never forgiven me for marrying her brother. To her, I was an intruder, a woman from nowhere who had stolen the life of privilege she thought only people of their kind deserved. I saw her that afternoon, sitting in the parlor with a cup of tea, her smile soft and poisonous. "You've been restless lately," she said, tilting her head. "I hope you're not unhappy." There was something in her tone, too sweet, too deliberate, that made my stomach twist. I forced a polite laugh and said nothing, pretending not to notice the small folded paper on the armrest beside her teacup. The letter. My letter. When Thomas entered moments later, Eleanor stood gracefully, her smile widening as she held it out to him. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I found it while checking the rooms. It seems our dear Clara has a rather romantic admirer." The world seemed to tilt. Thomas took the letter slowly, unfolded it, and read. I watched the change in his face, not a burst of anger, but a gradual tightening, like a storm being contained behind glass. The air thickened. My heartbeat roared in my ears. When his eyes finally met mine, there was no shouting, no visible rage, just a cold, quiet certainty that froze me where I stood. "So, this is what you've been doing," he said softly. "Writing love notes while I've been providing you with everything." I tried to speak, to explain that I hadn't sent it, that the letter was a relic of something long gone, but my voice refused to come. He didn't wait for excuses. He turned to Eleanor, handed her the paper, and said in a tone that made my blood run cold, "Thank you. You've done the right thing." That was the last time I saw Eleanor smile at me. He ordered the staff to take me upstairs, not violently, but efficiently, as though I were simply another item to be moved out of sight. My protests dissolved into the echo of my own footsteps on the staircase. When the door to my room closed behind me, I heard the click of the lock slide into place. For hours, I sat by the window, staring at the garden that once represented freedom, and now looked like a painting hung just beyond reach. The sun went down, the house fell silent, and I understood what Thomas had done. He hadn't just locked me in, he had erased me. Meals were brought by a new maid who never met my eyes. The phone was gone. The curtains were drawn. The world outside continued to breathe, but I no longer existed within it. Each day, I could hear faint murmurs in the hallway, Thomas's voice, calm and commanding, and Eleanor's sharp as glass. She had become his confidant, his ally in control. The betrayal cut deeper because she had once pretended to be my friend. When Thomas finally came to see me, it wasn't anger I saw in his eyes. It was possession. He walked into the room as though inspecting property he already owned. "You belong to me," he said quietly, almost tenderly, his fingers tracing the edge of the table. "Everything you have, everything you are, is mine. You understand that now, don't you?" His calmness terrified me more than any threat could. There was no rage, no violence, just certainty, unshakable and final. I nodded because defiance meant danger, and I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. That night, after he left, I lay on the floor, staring at the locked door. The air was thick, the silence absolute. I thought about Daniel, about the river, about the letter that had started it all. I thought about how love wasn't the danger. Ownership was. Thomas didn't just want my loyalty. He wanted my soul, stripped of will, of voice, of choice. And in that moment, something inside me hardened into resolve. I realized I could no longer live waiting for rescue. If freedom wouldn't come to me, I would have to claim it, even if it meant breaking the world that held me. I rose, trembling but certain, every nerve alive with defiance. The fear that had kept me quiet for so long began to fade, replaced by something sharp and unstoppable. And that night, I made my final plan, one that couldn't fail. Some nights, courage doesn't whisper. It screams, loud enough to drown out every warning that's ever kept you still. It rises like something ancient inside you, something wild that refuses to die quietly, something that no threat, no lock, no fear can silence. That night, the air inside the mansion felt too heavy to breathe, the gold-lined walls pressing closer until the only way to stay alive was to run. I had been patient for too long, and now the waiting itself had become a kind of death. The plan had been growing in the dark corners of my mind since the night Thomas locked me away. I had memorized the rhythm of footsteps outside my door, the exact moment when the guards changed shifts, the creak of the floorboard near the staircase that betrayed careless movement. For days I practiced calm during daylight, then rehearsed escape in my dreams. When the moon rose full and cold, I knew it was time. The house slept in unnatural stillness, the sort of silence that comes from power, a silence that expects obedience. I moved slowly, every motion deliberate, my pulse steady only because terror had worn itself out. I slid the old servant's key from the hollow leg of my vanity, the one place Thomas never thought to search. It was small, rusted, ancient, a relic from before he rebuilt the mansion into a monument to control. The corridor outside my room was dim, lit only by the glow of the security lamps. I could hear the muffled voices of the new staff downstairs, the ones hired to watch, rather than serve. I waited until their conversation faded, until one door shut and another opened, the signal of the shift change. My breath caught as I turned the key in the lock. The soft click was louder than thunder. Every step down the staircase was a negotiation with fear. The portraits along the walls seemed to watch, their painted eyes gleaming faintly in the dark. The memory of Thomas's voice followed me like a curse. You belong to me. For a second, my courage faltered. And then I saw the faint outline of the kitchen door ahead, half open, the scent of cold night drifting in. I slipped inside. The room smelled of metal and spice, the air heavy with yesterday's heat. I moved toward the back door, careful to avoid the loose tiles I'd memorized years ago. The old servant's gate waited at the far end of the courtyard, hidden behind hedges thick with dew. I pressed the second key into the lock. It resisted at first, groaning softly, then gave way. The gate opened, and for the first time in months, I stepped outside as a free woman. The cold air hit my lungs like fire, sharp and cleansing. I didn't dare look back. The gravel cut through my thin slippers, but I kept running, my heartbeat sinking with the wind. The mansion receded behind me, a monster fading into the mist, and every stride forward felt like a stolen breath of life. The road was empty, the night enormous. I followed the sound of distant traffic, the hum of a world that had kept turning without me. My legs ached, my feet bled, my breath tore at my throat. But I couldn't stop. Each rustle of leaves sounded like pursuit, each flicker of light like discovery. The darkness pressed in from all sides, yet somewhere ahead I could hear the low murmur of water. The river. When I reached it, the world tilted. The fog hung thick over the surface, and the moonlight shimmered faintly on the current. I stumbled to the edge, clutching the rough bark of a tree to keep from collapsing. My body trembled, not from exhaustion, but from disbelief. I had made it. I was standing where he said he'd be. The road meets the river. But the night wasn't silent. In the distance, the crunch of tires on gravel echoed through the fog. A pair of headlights appeared, cutting through the mist like twin blades of light. I froze. It could have been anyone. A stranger, a savior, or the man I was running from. My breath came in shallow bursts as the car slowed, stopping a few feet away. The engine idled, steady and low. For a moment, the world balanced on a knife's edge. The driver's door opened slowly, the sound crisp in the cold air. I couldn't see the face, only a shadow stepping into the light. My heart pounded so violently it hurt. Part of me wanted to turn and run, to vanish into the trees before whoever it was could reach me. But another part, the part that still believed in the letter, in the promise, in Daniel, kept me rooted where I stood. The fog wrapped around us, and the river whispered against the stones. The figure moved closer, and I caught the faint outline of familiar shoulders, the curve of a jaw I thought I'd never see again. My knees gave way slightly as I gripped the tree for balance, torn between terror and hope. The car door shut softly behind him, and the headlights cast his silhouette across the mist, blurred but heartbreakingly familiar. My throat tightened as he stepped forward, one slow, deliberate pace at a time. I wanted to call out, to believe, to surrender to the miracle, but fear clenched its hand around my heart. The night held its breath with me, every sound suspended in uncertainty. And when the door opened, I wasn't sure if I was saved or caught. Fate drives faster than fear, and that night it found me before despair could claim the last of my strength. When the figure stepped out of the fog, my heart knew him before my eyes did, the recognition hitting with the force of salvation and sorrow all at once. It was Daniel, the one person I had been running toward in every dream and every heartbeat since the world turned against me. In that moment, every wound, every scar, every fear I had carried dissolved into the warmth of his arms. I stumbled forward, my voice breaking on his name, and before I could fall, he caught me. The dam inside me shattered. Tears poured out faster than words could form. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence that had once separated us now held the weight of everything we'd lost and everything we had somehow managed to keep. Faith, love, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, we had survived the worst. Daniel led me into the car without a word, wrapping his jacket around my shoulders as the engine rumbled to life. We drove until dawn, chased the fog away, until the city disappeared behind us and the horizon opened like a promise we weren't sure we deserved. I remember watching the first rays of light spill across his face, calm, steady, resolute, and realizing that even though we were both bruised by the same storm, he had never stopped being my anchor. He took me to a small town by the sea, a place too ordinary to attract suspicion, where the scent of salt mixed with the sound of laughter, and no one knew our names. We rented a modest room above a flower shop, the kind of space that smelled of fresh beginnings. For the first time in years, I slept without fear. The nightmares came, yes, but when I woke, his hand was always there, solid, real, grounding me to a life that no longer required permission to exist. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the rhythm of living returned. I found work at a local school, teaching art to children who painted their joy without shame or restraint. Watching their tiny hands smear color across blank paper felt like watching my own heart rediscover breath. Daniel started driving again, not for power or status, but for honesty. He built a small business, client at a time, his days filled with quiet dignity and the kind of peace neither of us had known before. But even in that peace, fear lingered like a shadow just beyond the door. Sometimes, when the wind howled through the streets at night, I would wake suddenly, convinced I heard footsteps outside. Sometimes Daniel would pause mid-conversation, his eyes scanning the distance, his hand tightening around mine. We never spoke of it, but both of us knew that safety was not the same as freedom, that ghosts can follow even those who flee. Still, we built our lives as if the future had forgiven us, daring to dream that the world had forgotten our names. I learned to laugh again, to paint, to walk barefoot on the sand without worrying who was watching. Daniel learned to smile with both his eyes and his heart. And yet, no matter how far we ran, There was one truth we couldn't escape. Peace, in our story, was never meant to last forever. It was early evening when the knock came. Gentle at first, almost polite, the kind that doesn't announce danger but conceals it. I froze, the paintbrush slipping from my hand as Daniel's eyes met mine across the room. Neither of us spoke, but the silence between us said everything. It had found us. The past, patient and relentless, had finally caught up. And one day, that knock finally came. I thought I'd escaped. But ghosts don't stay buried. They find their way through time and distance, carried by whispers you can't quite silence. The knock on our door that evening wasn't loud, yet it tore through the fragile peace we'd built like thunder through glass. Daniel's hand hovered above the latch, hesitation flickering in his eyes, while my heart thudded against my ribs. Every beat a reminder that the past had a way of arriving uninvited. And when the door opened, the man standing there wasn't a shadow of vengeance. He was the messenger of closure. He wore a dark coat, rain clinging to the fabric, his hat tilted low as though he carried the weight of someone else's sins. "Mrs. Wainwright?" he asked softly, and for a second hearing that name again felt like a slap. My breath caught, my fingers curling against Daniel's sleeve for balance. The man continued, his tone practiced, almost apologetic. "I come from Thomas's estate. There's been an incident." The world seemed to still. He spoke of a sudden illness, a collapse during one of Thomas's business meetings, death arriving swiftly and without mercy. No intrigue, no revenge, just the cold finality of fate. My hands trembled as I took the envelope he offered. "A will," he said, though there was nothing left for me to inherit. Inside was a single note, written in Thomas's unmistakable hand. "You were never mine to own." I felt no victory, only release, as if some invisible thread had finally been cut. The guilt, the fear, the years of silence dissolved into something softer, almost like forgiveness. That night, Daniel and I walked to the edge of the sea, the horizon washed in gold. He took my hand, and together we watched the sun climb above the water, a promise that the world could begin again. But even now, when the nights are quiet and headlights flash across our window, I sometimes wake before dawn, my heart racing, my breath uneven. I tell myself it's only memory, only the sea reflecting light. Yet deep inside, a voice still whispers, "Ghosts don't rest. They wait." And sometimes they remember where you live. If this story touched your heart, or made you question what love and freedom truly mean, don't leave silently. Tell me in the comments. Would you have stayed or run? Your words keep these stories alive, so hit the like button if you felt her pain, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. And if you want more stories that make your heart race and your soul ache, subscribe, because the next one begins where this one ends.